Hello and welcome. Now, for many years of its existence, Leyland, and indeed British Leyland, were big players in the export market and for lorries. Buses. Now, you've heard me mention many times on this channel about Leyland's take it or leave it attitude, and that was something that they'd built up due to all the success they'd had with the various chassis and different types of buses, and again lorries, over all the years. Leyland had put itself on a bit of a pedestal, and you can argue that quite rightly so as well. And looking back into history, it's hard to believe that such a company that was respected worldwide is no longer with us and was allowed to disappear by the UK government. Well, that's political enough as I'm going to get on the subject. But needless to say, I'm sure there's many of you who will have a similar view, a different view, or at least a comment of some kind on the whole saga of Leyland and how they disappeared off the face of the earth. As I said, a big part of Leyland's success was through exports. Chassis such as the original Tiger, the Olympic, the Panther and the Worldmaster, to name a few. In latter days, even things like the Leyland Atlantean and the Leyland National were exported in fairly vast numbers. In fact, in the early 1960s, in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Leyland's export success ruffled a few feathers in the United States by continuing to supply buses to Cuba, while pretty much everybody else had put them on a trade embargo. Now I'm actually planning a video on the Cuban Leyland Olympics, so if you'd like to watch that and find out how Leyland got up the nose of President Kennedy, please comment down below. On the 1st of September 1967, Sweden changed from driving on the left, the same as the UK, to driving on the right, the same as the rest of continental Europe. Now, in the past, Leyland had supplied Sweden with various batches of buses, which again, in my opinion, says something about the quality or the reputation of Leyland as an export at the time, especially when you consider there's companies such as Volvo and Scania building the same sort of vehicles in the country that they were selling them to. Now, with the change to driving on the right, Stockholm Tramways was faced with a choice. They could either adapt the existing vehicles or they could buy brand new ones. And that's a very sweeping statement because it makes it sound very easy. Just move the doors and the driving cab to the other side of the bus and job done. But it's a lot of engineering and it's a lot of cost as well. So Stockholm Tramways decided to withdraw 400 older buses rather than to convert them to the opposite side operation. In 1965, Stockholm put out the tenders for the new builder of the buses that they wanted. And at that time, Leyland and Park Royal built a complete prototype out of their own initiative and sent it over to Stockholm. Now, interestingly, at the time, Sweden was obviously still driving on the left-hand side of the road, so it had to be a bus configured for that, for the demonstration purposes, to the British standard design. They sent over a PSUR chassis. Now, for those of you who are uninitiated in Leyland chassis codes, PS, passenger single deck, UR, underfloor rear. It was a Leyland Panther and had the chassis number L24381. This demonstration to Stockholm Tramways paid off because Leyland received a large order for 200 Panthers and 50 Leyland Atlanteans. Although the chairman of Leyland at the time, Donald Stokes, was to say that this was the hardest sell that the company had had to ever do. Incidentally, the right-hand prototype returned back to Leyland, where it contributed to the early proving and testing for the production models. It stayed with Leyland way up until 1971 and then was resold to Forest Coach Lines of Sydney. The result that Leyland had won the tender was announced in early 1966, and this tender was worth £2.5 million, and it was fought against many worldwide competitors. So again, this is testimony to how big a player Leyland was at the time in the global commercial vehicle market. Now, before we get on to the main event, which are the Leyland Atlanteans, I'm going to mention the Panthers. They were all to be bodied by Park Royal and were 37 foot 6 inch long. They seated 39 passengers and had dual doors. There was provision for 32 standing passengers. They featured things like radio telephone for contact with the base garage, public address speakers for the inside and the outside, very similar to how the London DMS initially would have when that was launched in the early 1970s. And the centre exits were controlled by photoelectric cells, so when you walked up to them they automatically opened. Both the Panthers and the Leyland Atlanteans were designed to be one man or one person operated. Now, Stockholm was one of the first cities in the world to employ women bus drivers, and by 1967 they were employing around 200 of them. Now, it's quite unusual for a country on mainland Europe to order a double-decker bus. Now, Stockholm thought that double-deckers with a high seating capacity would be more popular than single-decker buses with a high amount of standing passengers, although the Atlanteans' use was very much dependent on where they could be used. Like the Panthers, the Atlanteans were bodied by Park Royal and were 36 foot 4.5 inches long by 8 foot 2.5 inches wide, and they were 14 foot and a half inch high. And at that point, this made them the biggest buses ever built in Britain. In fact, these Atlanteans were so big, the story is that Park Royal had problems physically getting them out of the factory due to the length of the buses. The bodywork featured a lot of the same features that the Park Royal bodied Panthers had. In addition to being dual-doored, the buses also featured 2 staircases as well, one opposite each doorway, as it was felt that this would help improve the flow of passengers through the bus. As a result of this, the Atlanteans had a very modest seating capacity of 71, and that was 43 seats upstairs and 28 seats downstairs. Again, like the Panthers, the exit doors were controlled by photoelectric cells, but the photoelectric cells were also installed on the staircase and checked the number of passengers on the upper deck to make sure that it didn't get overloaded upstairs. The cab layout was also very similar to the Panthers. These big Atlanteans were powered by an 0680 engine, which gave 165 brake horsepower, and this drove through a Voith fully automatic torque converter controlled by push buttons, in the same way that things like the Metro bus did in latter years. Air suspension was also standard, as was power assisted steering. And they also featured dual line air brakes, a spring handbrake, and, interestingly, a roof-level exhaust discharge. Now, a roof-level exhaust was seen on one of the prototype Leyland Atlanteans, 281 ATC, but it was a design that was not perpetuated in the UK. Now, one other little feature of these buses that was to become a standard on Swedish vehicles from the change of driving from the left onto the right was the headlights had to be on when the ignition was on. And we all remember seeing the Volvo cars driving around in the 70s, 80s and early 90s with the headlights on all the time. And this was a feature that came from this change of driving from one side of the road to the other. Now, unfortunately, there is a saying that says big isn't necessarily better. And this saying can be applied to these Leyland Atlanteans because unfortunately, they weren't destined to have long lives with Stockholm Tramways. They were to prove mechanically troublesome, and the bodywork with the length was prone to flexing and causing water ingress. And unfortunately, by 1976, they'd all been withdrawn from passenger service in the city, with the Leyland Panthers being withdrawn even before the Atlanteans. There's meant to be 3 of the Stockholm Leyland Atlanteans that survived into preservation. But don't you think it's such a shame that this specification Atlantean wasn't taken up by a British operator? Ignore the length, but think of the Voith gearbox and the air suspension in the 1960s. That is absolutely cutting-edge technology, isn't it? We could have had buses running in the UK to the similar specification as the MCW Metro bus, almost 10 years before the Metro bus was conceived and designed and built. Later in the UK, there would be the choice of the Voith gearbox option, and it was taken up by companies like South Yorkshire PTE. In fact, one of the best Leyland Atlanteans I have ever driven was a former South Yorkshire example. Being fitted with a Voith gearbox, it made a bit of an interesting noise, that famous Leyland Atlantean howl and the Voith howl combined. And whilst it certainly wasn't the fastest bus, it was ever so smooth. The bus had been open-topped and was being used for the Canterbury City sightseeing tour, which involved a hill climb up to the university and then a climb down from the university back into the city. This Atlantean was fitted with a Telma retarder on the dashboard, in the same way that the early coaches were fitted with a Telma. Basically, it's a lever that sticks up from the dashboard and you pull it down several clicks to activate it and thus slow the vehicle down, in addition to the usual conventional foot brake. So when coming downhill from the university, you could just put the retarder on a couple of clicks and the bus would make this very nice, slow, controlled descent, and you wouldn't actually have to touch the foot brake at all. It was all very smooth and all very futuristic for its time. The bus was a 1978 bus, by which point we already had the Metro bus in production. But it's just a shame that this wasn't made available or chosen by operators a lot earlier. Now, one other thing that's food for thought. Leyland Bus, as we all know, got taken over by Volvo. And, of course, Volvo is a Swedish company. So do we think that this great export heritage that Leyland had some influence on the fact that Volvo wanted to buy Leyland Bus? Now, I'm not talking specifically about the Stockholm Atlanteans and Panthers, but do you think that it played a part? It could have done? Maybe. Please comment down below. I love reading your comments. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this look at these rather impressive, yet rather strange Leyland Atlanteans. And I hope the fact that they're left-hand drive and from overseas didn't put you off too much. If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss my future releases. And don't forget to hit the little notification bell so that you'll receive notifications of my future releases. All money raised through YouTube goes towards the restoration and continued preservation of the buses within the Southern Counties Omnibus Collection. And by watching this video, you're helping old vintage buses. And that makes you such an incredibly lovely, wonderful person. You also look like a bus enthusiast of good taste, so don't forget to check out my other bus related videos here on YouTube. There's going to be something for you. I'm sure there is. I can guarantee it. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.